Hello everyone and greetings from the Japan Foundation Kuala Lumpur. My name is Amira and I would like to thank all of you for joining us today via Facebook Live. This program called JFKL Talk Series. So this program was initiated to reach out everyone and to introduce more about Japan through the lenses of professional in different fields. So for our very first episode today, we are delighted to have our speaker, Mr. Mahen Bala.
Hi,
Hi
Amira.
Mahen, hi. Mahen, thank you very much for today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so allow me to share a bit about Mahen. Mahen is a documentarian and also a visual artist. In 2018, Mahen published a book called Postcards from the South, which is a comprehensive record of memory and history of the Malaysian railways. In 2019, Mahen was awarded Japan Foundation Asia Center Fellowship, which to extend his work on railway heritage in Java and also Japan. Okay, so for today's session, it will be split into two sections, two parts. The first part is the sharing by Mahen, and the second part is the Q&A. So we will have a short break during the first part and the second part before the Q&A session. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask Mahen, you can please share in the comment section. So we will gather for the Q&A afterwards. And then also there are some downloadable documents in the comment section. So please check out the comment sections to download those documents. Okay, without further ado, let us welcome Mahen to begin his sharing titled Longing and Belonging, Portraits of Different People in Japan. Okay, Mahen.
Thank you, Amira. Thank you for such a nice introduction. Sorry, I'm feeling a bit nervous. After quite some time of all of us being in lockdown, it feels a bit odd to suddenly, be speaking to people. In the time from when we first started talking about the talk and now, I've changed the title a little bit. So now it's actually Longing and Belonging, but portraits of people and places in Japan. So here's the thing. I think we're all very familiar with Japan. We know where it is. We wear Japanese branded clothes. We eat Japanese food. We consume Japanese media. In fact, I would argue that we as Southeast Asians, we encounter and consume Japanese culture so much more intimately than most Southeast Asian countries itself. So let me just show you a few things that we might all be very familiar with. All of these things that we are seeing are essentially famous Japanese cultural icons. And so even Godzilla loves the trains. I don't know why he's eating trains here. Yeah, so the thing is that I think within the last century and a half, Japanese culture itself has developed as a response to various changes in ways of thinking about their own identity. There are many factors that contributed to these successive changes in these ways of thinking. Among them are, of course, gunboat diplomacy, when Japan was forced to open to trade with the West, and then we have the successive periods of long periods of war, period of occupation, and then later the post-war economic boom. All of these things brought about so much changes to the Japanese landscape. So in essence, this was a time of rapid changes as Japan rapidly absorbed Western culture. And at the same time, it reached deep into its past to find its own cultural traits. So this essentially brought about this idea of the duality of Japanese culture. And by something having a dual identity essentially means that it is without a unified essence. So if we were to try to define Japanese culture with just this one thing, one idea, I think we would all struggle. But when we use ideas that are seemingly conflicting with each other, we find that, yes, it does explain Japanese culture. So in essence, the culture of the Japanese present is very much defined by both the past and the future. And seeing these elements side by side is actually not conflicting at all. It is very much complementary. So now, let me just give you a bit of introduction for how we can think about culture. So from the outside, we tend to approach the idea of a culture of a particular group of people in a country as a single unified idea. But then we then realize that from the outside, we might look at it as one thing, but from within, we can actually see it as being the result or the cultural expression of separate entities. On one hand, we have the state and corporations, which I would classify as being very highly visible. They can function across boundaries and they have huge capital. They have a lot of capacity. And on the other hand, we have individuals and community, which tends to remain somewhat invisible. And they tend to be, it's important to contextualize them within the environment itself. So we can see these two levels functioning here. Now, sometimes these entities, they tend to overlap, right? They overlap significantly. So sometimes the national construct is so pervasive that they gobble everything up, that the individual and the community becomes only a subset of the large national identity, like how we see in B. But sometimes they're completely detached, like how we see in C. So in essence, different cultures across the world will locate themselves differently according to these models. It would be interesting for us to consider, like, which model do you think is relevant to describe Malaysia, the Malaysian identity, and which is applicable to Japan? And so as we start looking at railway culture, the Japanese railway culture, I would very much like to ask all of you to please have your Google Maps open. As we move from one place to the next, I hope you will take the time to look these places up. So these are, it's now that we are in this environment where travel is restricted, I hope this is a way that we can just sort of travel together. So let us begin. I know the first place that we're going to start is in Kyoto. So while I was in Kyoto, my host in Japan, Professor Anthony, he had introduced me to a fellow member of the Japanese Railway Society, Professor Kiyohito. So Professor Kiyohito had been researching for quite some time on the topics of tramways and light railways, particularly the idea of social capital. So Professor Kiyohito was very interested in looking at how we can assess the benefits of the railways beyond the economic benefits. One thing to keep in mind here is that after the privatization of the railways in Japan in the 80s, Japanese railway companies became very closely linked with prefectural governments rather than the national government. And such, we have different companies functioning in different prefectures who have very mutual needs with the local government itself. And because of that, there is an expectation by the communities in these places for the railway companies to provide services that are beyond just transportation. So in the prefectures in Japan, the railway companies are expected to be involved in hospitality, retail, F&B, tourism, and in many cases, even arts and culture. So the Kyoto station, I think, is a perfect example of this. The map that you see here, which is at the railway station itself, shows a layout of old Kyoto when it was the capital of Japan. So the first Kyoto station was opened for service by the decree of Emperor Meiji on February 5th, 1877. So since then, of course, the station has undergone many revisions. And today, the station is one of the largest buildings in Japan. We are so used to seeing railway stations as being this single-story or second-story building or two-story building. But the Kyoto station, the current one, is 15 stories. This is how it looks like inside. It's 15 stories that includes a shopping mall, a hotel, a movie theater, a department store, a bus terminal, subway, multiple railway lines, and even government facilities are all at the train station. So here we can see how it serves as transportation, but also retail and cultural hub for Kyoto. So if you look at the station from above, what we see is, this is how big the station is. And if you are there and you look at the buildings that are around the station, you realize that many of these buildings are services that belong to the railway company itself. So in order to understand more about social capital of the railways, Professor Kyohito insisted that I had to experience the tram system in Hiroshima. And that's exactly where I would go next. So I would visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki to see how, to see the relationship between social capital and the railways. And so in Hiroshima, the system is called Hiroden, which is short for Hiroshima Densha. The system began operating in 1910. And this is a regular scene, like from the street in Hiroshima. But here's the thing, right? We all know what a tram is. We know how they function. What is it that makes the one in Hiroshima so special? For me, from my observation, I think the system itself functions as an expression of history and continuity for Hiroshima. And so this idea of historical continuity is not just limited to taking something and keeping it in the museum, or just by having a museum dedicated to Hiroshima's history and saying, once upon a time we had the tram and it looked this way. But instead, how they have continuity is by making sure that the same system that started running in 1910 is still running until now. Literally the same cars are still running. In fact, there is a special car that is called the number 653 tram. And this tram is important because it survived the atomic bombing. And it still runs today during the summer operation. So it's a very interesting idea of how, if there are things that don't work with the trams, then the idea is to just fix it and to continue fixing it, rather than to just completely replace everything with a completely new system, which might create a situation where society in Hiroshima feels somewhat detached from it, historically and culturally. So in essence, we can see all of these criteria or these attributes that are there in the tram system. Very lively interior, ease of navigation, and most importantly, I think there is the visual charm of seeing something that's almost like a relic of the past, still functioning as in contemporary times. And I would observe the same thing in Nagasaki. In Nagasaki, it is called Nagaden, which stands for Nagasaki Densha. So the company is called the Nagasaki Electric Tramway. Began operation in 1915. What I really like to show here is observe the different designs of the trams, the cars. We are so used to looking at trams as being this very uniform system. Everything looks the same, right? That one car that arrives now would be the same one that arrives later. But in Nagasaki, it's quite different, where you see various different models from different eras. They're all functioning side by side. This is so fascinating to observe. I mean, just imagine how people themselves would feel when they look at these different cars from different eras. I myself, I think I would be very proud if I was an older generation living in these cities, and I would able to look at something that I used to write on from when I was much younger, and to be able to share that with the younger generation today. So that creates not just this sense of commonality between the generations, but also creates a sense of trust that these companies will be around for quite some time. And the fact that the local government also considers these things when they are operating the tramways. So that's why I think the tramways illustrates this very important idea in building social capital, and how we can go about assessing, like, why would these systems be so important to a particular society. Our way of thinking about benefit essentially shifts from one that is just purely economic, thinking about how much profit you can get, how it can benefit the businesses in that area and whatnot, to thinking about how we actually interact with this on a daily basis. And this is how it looks like running on the street. Let me just show you a video of tram arriving. For some reason, I myself get excited every time one of these old trams arrive. There is yet another important landmark that I just wanted to briefly talk about, which is the Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima. I won't go into details about the museum itself. I think this is something that you'll be very much interested in reading about. It's, I think, one of the best museums that is commemorating a particular tragedy in human history. But it was here that I met a young boy who was traveling to Hiroshima, guided by his teacher. And his teacher stopped me while I was just standing outside of this museum. And he had a list of questions with him. And he read out these questions in English. It was all written out very nicely. And he was really nervous. I can imagine being that nervous if I were to ask someone questions in Japanese. So I listened carefully to his questions and answered it. And then I returned questions to him in English. And I asked him, "Where are you from?" And this only made him even more nervous. So very shyly, he looked down and he whispered his answer. And I couldn't hear what was his answer, but his teacher had to answer it for him. And I realized that he was from a very small town that is just outside of Hiroshima. Because I took the local train, I had passed through this town. I was just paying attention to the signboards. So I remember seeing this town. And so I told him that, "Hey, you know what? I know where your town is. I had passed through your town before." One thing that really struck me was how his demeanor completely changed when he heard that. He was so happy. He was just smiling away. Perhaps that was a sense of, we had something in common in that moment. This boy from a small town outside of Hiroshima and myself as an outsider who's in Japan, and we both connected by knowing his small town. And just before he left, he would end up giving me a small paper crane that he folded, which I think it is today remains a symbol of peace in Hiroshima. I still have this paper crane with me, and it just brings it just makes me happy to think about that encounter. So I just wanted to share that. So the next place that we're going to visit is the Sanriku coast. So what happens in Sanriku coast? This is a satellite image of the Sanriku coast, a small section of it in 2007. And so what happened was that in 2011, there was the Great East Japan earthquake, and a tsunami struck the Tohoku region. So this was on March 11, 2011. More than 5,000 lives were lost in Iwate, primarily along this area on the coast. Until today, about more than 1,000 people are still missing. So if you look at this area here, this is where the city is. And this green part here is an embankment. It's a pine forest that was built by the previous generation in anticipation of the next tsunami. So let's see what happens in 2011. You can see how the tsunami had completely wiped out this place. This is a closer look of what the place looks like, what Rikuzen Takata looks like in 2011. So what I really wanted to talk about in this area is about the Sanriku Railway and what it means to the people here. So what happens here? Sanriku Railway. So we can see here, Sanriku Railway essentially connects Kuji to Miyako, to Kamaishi, to Sakari. But due to the tsunami and certain things that happened later, these lines would get disconnected. So why is this Sanriku line so important? Now, while a majority of these lines were run by the JR company, which is the Japan Railways Company, a much larger company in the past, what happens is that some lines that are deemed to be unprofitable by private companies are basically the operations are stopped. But then because certain communities or this local government might feel that these lines are actually quite important for them, what they would do is they would form another company, a new company that becomes a private and public funded company to run these railways. This is known as the third sector company. So the Sanriku Railway was founded in 1981 and started its service in 1984. So when the earthquake happened and the subsequent tsunami, the railway line sustained damage at about 300 locations and had about 5.8 kilometers of line just washed away. Of course, a railway line being destroyed is, the people there consider it a natural process. Things get broken. So what do you do when things are broken? You make an attempt to fix it back. So the lines were restored in 2014, but it remains separated between this area, Miyako and Kamaishi. There is this whole idea of things happening in cycles. And so even though after the line was fixed, what happened in 2019 was that there was a typhoon. So Typhoon Hagibis arrived and it damaged the line again. So what do you do when it's damaged again? You continue fixing it. Right? And so there is this, what happens in Sanriku is that the Sanriku Railway is no longer just about movement. It's not just about transportation, but it becomes a symbol of solidarity. I met many people, among them Tsuboi-san, Kato-san. These are locals who had helped me conduct interviews and while traveling around this region. One thing that I realized from meeting the both of them is that they were both not from Iwate. They are not from this region. So I was very curious as to why. Why would you come and stay in these places? And their very simple answer is that after the earthquake and the tsunami, they just felt that the community needed help. And so they just transplanted themselves from larger cities, from Tokyo. They just came to Iwate and they settled down permanently. And now they are trying their best to help the economy. So this is I think, I wouldn't be going too deeply into the Memorial Museum, although I think it is very, very interesting, mainly because it serves as an entity to hand down knowledge about the tsunami, about living with tsunami from one generation to the next. So I really hope that you'll be able to just look up about the Tsunami Memorial Museum and just read up a little bit about it. There's also the concept of Tendenko, which I think is very interesting for us to study. It's actually, I think, applicable to Malaysia as well, since we have recurrent floods. But just going back to the impact of the tsunami itself, Let me just play this video. So you can see the environment here, right? The earthquake had changed not just the lifestyle of the people, but also the layout of these towns. Now, in the past, the layout of these towns was not like this at all. All of this is newly built in the reconstruction efforts. The main thing that you would observe here is that the layout of the town is now more car-friendly than before. So essentially, people are moving and changing their lifestyle to accommodate cars and no longer relying on trains. And yet, train continues to remain as a very important thing, very important symbol for them. So if in the years before the disaster, people, I think they took very few rides in a month. In fact, most of them don't even use the train. But after the disaster, there was a strong desire among the community that says, yes, definitely, please fix the train. Even the president of the railway company, during our interview, he said that he feels that it is important for the people to be able to see the railway or the trains running again, because that means that they can also move forward in life. It gives them this idea that their wounds can also heal, that there is hope that these places can recover. Now, of course, healing takes time, and healing is also not always in the hands of just the government. Small actions, I think, can have a tremendous impact. So as I showed you earlier, since the section between Kamaishi and Miyako was no longer in operation, I had to take a feeder bus to visit this place called Nami Takaigan. You can see here, I've highlighted the bus stop. This is literally where the bus stopped. There is currently not even a sign. So I left my bag under a tree, and then I crossed the rusted tracks of the train station, where trains had not run in quite some time. Any railway fan would know that it's quite a pitiful sight. It's a sad sight to see a rusted railway track. And I started walking around the neighborhood. Now, why was I visiting this place? Believe it or not, I was walking around looking for the phone booth. But it was not just any phone booth. It's a very important, special phone book. And finally, I found it. It was hidden away in someone's garden, actually. The phone booth is called the Kaze no Denwa, which literally means phone of the wind. So I walked into this person's garden, private garden, and then I asked him permission. Can I see and photograph the phone booth? And he said, many people come to take a photo of the phone book, but that's not the purpose of it. And he reminded me that I can take photos, but please don't post it up on social media. So I never posted it up. So this is a special phone book because it is about closure. The owner himself had lost someone important in the 2011 earthquake. So what he did was he set up a phone booth for people to come and sit down and be able to talk to their loved ones. Now, if you see here, this phone, right? This phone is not connected to anything. The wires are all jumbled up here. But there is a chair here so that people can sit for however long they need. I think what we can learn from here is that rebuilding the landscape is of course important, like what we saw earlier. But then again, having an opportunity to gain closure is equally important. While I was there, I just looked inside the notebook, and I realized that someone was just there to talk to their loved ones just the day before my visit. As I left the house, thanked him. He also showed me his another space that he had created as a children's library, as a library for books for children. So as I left the house, I crossed the rusted tracks again, and I sat down facing the sea. There were these stools. Mind you, this is not the bus stand, even though there are stools for someone, for people to sit. So while I was sitting here, there were two men who were jogging by. One of them stopped. Actually, both of them, they stopped. And the first man, he started telling me about his family. And he was telling me how 9 years ago, a big tsunami destroyed this place. His house was on a hill, so he was very lucky. But his wife's sister was living someplace else. And he simply, what he did was he just said, my wife's sister. And then he ended his sentence with a finger across the neck. The second man reminded me that I was waiting at the wrong place for the bus. So on the day of my visit, it was exactly 9 years since the great earthquake. It was the anniversary. So I had actually planned my visit to coincide with the anniversary. I thought it wouldn't be recognizable, that whatever footprint the earthquake had left or the tsunami had left on that place, it wouldn't be visible. But clearly it is still there. And the memory of it is still very much alive. So in this sense, recovering from one setback allows the people to be resilient in the event of another. So in that same year, the line that was damaged by the typhoon I described earlier, it reopened, and service has since resumed. And this was a very important symbolic moment for everyone. Like, they got to see the railway line running again through this town. It was a very momentous time for them. And then came the pandemic. So in a way, these things are cyclic, and having things like the railways, having symbols like this, and having things like the phone booth is very important for people to be able to continue dealing with this kind of situations, or these kind of setbacks. So anyway, the train stops here for about 2 minutes. So I hope you can stretch your legs and grab a drink. I'll be back in 2 minutes, where I'll be speaking about the local trains. And welcome back to the second part, where I'll be talking about the local train. I've titled this, taking the local train to nowhere and everywhere, mainly because I just wanted to talk about this joy of just being on a train and traveling to so many places on a train that is somewhat slow. Because, I think sometimes we are so transfixed with the image of the Shinkansen, the bullet train, that we forget that the railway experience in Japan can be experienced at so many levels and in so many places. There's the express train, there's a local train. So the joy of going on the local train is that it stops in so many places. And many of these places, it even stops in places where there are no stations, in fact. There's just one signboard. And to get from one place to the next, it might require, if you're going on a long journey, it might require you to change trains about 12 to 13 times in that one trip. Thankfully, the trains are incredibly punctual, so that makes it easy. Using an app, you already know how long is your waiting time, which platform do you have to be on, and whatnot. So the nice thing about stations that are outside, stations that are in between places, in between the larger towns, is that they don't all look like Kyoto Station that I showed you earlier, which looks very much like a shopping mall. They all have unique characteristics. Of course, there's always social distancing on trains, even before social distancing due to the pandemic itself. So I'll just show you a few pictures about showing these different ways that smaller towns, or smaller train stations express their cultural identity. Just by being at these stations, you sort of get a feeling of the kind of things that are important to this place. Yeah. So the thing is that I think in many societies, we think of railway heritage as being synonymous with national heritage. And therefore, it introduces this idea of things being sacred. We look at it very seriously. And in countries where the railway lines are nationalized, we tend to employ a top-to-bottom approach. But in Japan, I would say that railway culture actually begins from the bottom, because in essence, it is an interplay between the community itself, the local government, and the railway company. These are all mutual needs. Right? For me, it brings about this sense of joy, just going to these stations and just seeing something very different. Even if at that time you don't really understand what it is, then you go back and you just read up about it. It brings about this feeling of having encountered something, this idea of us encountering different things, rather than having something that is just uniform from the beginning of the trip to the end, which is essentially how you'd feel when you sit in a bullet train. It goes so fast, you barely know what's happening outside. And the nice thing, of course, many people will be familiar with this, is the railway stamp, one of the most popular railway tourism products. So the railway stamp was first introduced in 1931 at a station in Fukui. And it entered popular culture when the Japanese National Railways at that time launched the Discover Japan campaign in 1970. So what they did was they provided 1,400 railway stations with individual stamps that all had the word Discover Japan written in English. Right? So, and then special notebooks were of course published so that travelers would be able to carry these notebooks around, travel the country, and collect all these stamps. Today, it is possible for you to actually buy a book that has a collection of all of these stamps that has ever existed, or you can travel on the local train and quickly run to the station each time we stop at one station to get the stamp. Let me just show you what it looks like in my notebook. These are some of the places that I managed to collect the stamps. There is just something about the physicality of it that is so interesting. Like, this is my notebook essentially. It is just so exciting to have all of these things because it becomes a proof that you were there. And these stamps are not automated. You have to go there and you have to take the stamp and you have to stamp it down on your book. And this last image that I've showed here is essentially the ticket that I used, right? The station Juhachi ticket, station 18 ticket, which is a very efficient way of traveling across the landscape and seeing as much as you can. So essentially you get 5 days of unlimited travel with this ticket. And you can see here, I only managed to stamp 4, as I had to leave Japan before I got the last one, house hat. But it's a nice souvenir to keep. So the nice thing about traveling on the local train is, of course, the sights, especially on the coast. I was particularly fascinated with this gentleman. He sat there just with his suitcase, and every once in a while, he would open his suitcase and he would take out something to eat. And he never looked around or even moved from his seat. Everything came out of and went back into the suitcase. All that existed in his world at that time was the train and the sea that he was looking at. There are so many places that you would be able to visit between the larger cities. So I'm just showing all these pictures to you to make you feel jealous about traveling in Japan. So one of the nicest places to visit is actually Uno. Uno is, of course, famous for being the gateway to Naoshima, the art island. You might have heard or at least seen the Pumpkin series, which everyone goes there just to photograph themselves with this series. Even the railway station in Uno is sort of designed to reflect its function. So I just wanted to share this brief story about my encounter at this ramen restaurant. So this is a place that I would have dinner every day. So at one point, the owner just, he brought this bowl of ramen, and he explained to me that the plate of gyoza that I ordered would take some time to arrive. And just as soon as he walked away, he turned around and he came back and asked, "Do you understand what I just said?" And I assured him that, yes, okay, I understood. And we both just shared that moment. Before leaving, he asked me, before I left the place, he asked me where I had gone and so forth. And when I explained to him that I was leaving Uno the next day, he ran to the back of the kitchen and he came back with this small maneki neko, which is the small waving cat. He told me his daughter loves to collect them and he wanted me to have it. It was such a simple gesture, but it really meant a lot to me. And until today, I still have it. I still keep it with me to remind myself of this encounter. So I'm just going to move on quickly to Fukuoka. I would like to just talk about the blue train. So it was in Fukuoka that I met up with Ryu Takahashi. He's an engineer, entrepreneur, who, along with a team of friends, he has been working on restoring one of the finest examples of Japanese engineering, the Nahanefu 22 1007 sleeping car. So popularly, it is called the Blue Train, but it is more accurately a luxurious sleeping car that was constructed in 1965. It was attached as the rear vehicle of many limited express blue trains, such as the Yuzuru and the Azakaze. But this is where I met Kazuma-kun. So these are the interior of the train, of the sleeping car that was restored by Takahashi-san and his friends. And this is where I met Kazuma-kun. So it was a young boy, I think now he's a young man. It's a young boy who was so adamant to being a part of the project. He felt very deeply passionate about this sleeping car. And so he regularly helps out with conducting tours about the history and specialty of this train, of this car. So during our interview, I asked him why. I think it's easy for us to look at a steam locomotive or a bullet train and then say, this is heritage. This is something that we should we should preserve it, we should restore it. And in brief, what he explained was that he felt a deep sense of love. This for me was so fascinating. How does a 12-year-old boy have a sense of love for one particular train? Not, next to this blue train, next to the sleeping car, there was actually another steam locomotive, but he couldn't care less about that locomotive. But he really felt that he loved this car. So it wasn't just we don't just look at it from a material perspective that this thing is old, but it also what it represented culturally. So for Kazuma-kun, this particular sleeping car represented the spirit of the Japanese railways. It was a spirit of continuous refinement in design and manufacturing, everything that was embodied in this the golden era of the Japanese railways. It's all there in this one sleeping car. So sometimes when you love something so deeply, it can be hard to put into words, isn't it? So while having dinner with the family, he pulled me aside because he wanted me to listen to something. I'm just going to play that recording.
ご乗車ありがとうございます。この電車は上野東京ラインをご利用くださいましてありがとうございます。この列車の一番前の車が1号車、一番後ろの車が15号車、特別車両グリーン車は4号車と5号車にございます。
Okay, so I'm just going to cut that short. But in essence, that was a recording of Kazuma-kun memorizing the train announcement in both Japanese and English. That was how deeply Kazuma-kun loves the railways. And I think that says so much, that just says so much. This love for the railways in Japanese culture is, of course, something that is nurtured. In essence, if we can love the systems that we create for ourselves, then we are in fact appreciating ourselves. As Kazuma-kun puts on his conductor's hat and shows people around, his parents are there accompanying him, right? And I felt as if I was witnessing something really special. But all of them who were involved in the project, from Takahashi-san to Kazuma-kun and his family, they made it look really effortless. And that's something that I feel very envious of. So in conclusion, I think, let me just conclude by saying that all of these things that we experience as culture, they are in fact expressions of certain feelings, ideas, and values. They are usually driven by something much deeper than just economic or political benefits. In fact, you will realize that almost everything that I've mentioned before, it doesn't deal with anything historical at all. So on the surface, I think, from outside, Japan can sometimes come across as being really cool with glass and concrete, futuristic everything. But at the heart of it, Japanese culture is very much, it nurtures a feeling society. In this entire presentation, I realized I left out so many people. These are stories that I wanted to include, but there's shortage of time. Right? There was the blind man in Nagasaki, the red folder in Shizuoka, meeting Ozu in Onomichi. But you know what? I'll save all of these stories for another day. I hope in this session I've managed to show you a slightly different layer of Japanese culture compared to what we started out with Pokemon and Doraemon and Godzilla. Right. So let me just end this with a story that was told to me by Mr. Ben Suzuki of the Japan Foundation in Japan. He told me a story about how in the past, Japanese families who couldn't really afford expensive train tickets, what they would do to travel is they would gather at home and they would discover Japan by riding on a train following the train timetable. So they would just sit at a table with drinks and snacks and everything. And they would say, okay, where are we going next? Okay, we're going to this place, we're going to Hokkaido. So let's get on this train. Okay, where are we now? Where are we now? Where are we now? So that's essentially a way, it was a weekend family activity where they could talk about places, landmarks, train stations, all while being at the comfort of home. So to all of you who had actually followed along on Google Maps and bothered looking it up, that's exactly what we managed to do today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Mahen. Thank you, Mahen. It's such a very interesting story. I'm feeling like inside the train at the moment. Okay. So let's take a short break before we proceed with the Q&A section. So if you have any comments, we already received comments and also questions, but don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere, and see you in a bit. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Okay, Mahen, let's start with the first question, shall we? Okay, so did you see the possibility of Malaysia to have our own railway museums? And then is there any potential for Malaysia to develop railway tourism?
I think this question about railway museums is exactly why I started this project. I was very intrigued with this idea of how in Indonesia there are 5 railway museums, and in Japan there are more than 20 railway museums. But why is it that in Malaysia, even though we have a strong memory, a strong connection with the railways, we don't have one? So I wanted to ask this question. I still don't have an answer, or rather I don't have a politically correct answer. But I think in recent years there have been talks about establishing one in Malaysia. But I think usually the conversation about a railway museum, we rely on the government to create a museum. We rely on the centralized approach that the government should be the one creating it, and then we just consume it. I think at this stage for Malaysia, any form of museum would be a welcome addition. But I think it would be more beneficial to us if we were to consider having a fragmented approach in creating a railway museum. Because what happens when you have a centralized approach is we take the national narrative, and then that supersedes the local narrative completely. So in essence, if you were to do a national railway museum, we run the risk of ignoring a lot of the local culture, which you would have seen earlier, like how, because railway museums and railway museums are so localized, they tend to feature their own culture. So I think if we are going to create a railway museum or railway museums in Malaysia, I would very much support the creation of localized museums. One way that we could actually do this is to repurpose the old railway station buildings. many of these buildings are left abandoned and then just rented out to restaurants, for example, or just left to rot. You know, if these places are converted to focus on railway history and local history, based on the needs of the community itself, then I think that would be a very worthwhile venture. And it would be something that people would be able to relate to as well. That I think is very important.
Yeah, and I can imagine how interesting it would be if different states in Peninsula have each museum.
Precisely.
Right. And because we have different cultures.
Yep.
So like, okay, Mahen, you also did research in Malaysia. You start with Malaysia first, and then you go to Indonesia and Japan for this fellowship. But how would you compare the railway culture in these countries?
I think the people in every country essentially has a different relationship with the railways. Some of these railways, usually railways are a product of industrialization, colonization. So when we look back at the history of different countries and how they came to be as modern states, then we get the answer as to how they would relate themselves to it. So if we were to look at, say, Indonesia, a very, very simple way of putting it is that Indonesia fought for independence, right? So the railways essentially becomes a way for them to reclaim their own narrative. So that's like their relationship with it. They are okay with looking at it as remnants of Dutch colonization, because now it's theirs. It's up to them to decide what happens to it. Whereas in Japan, you see a much more comprehensive look, a much more comprehensive relationship, because everything that is presented in museums are things that they created themselves. So, you know, even when you go to, let's say, Kyoto Railway Museum, there is a section dedicated to the evolution of railway toilet seats. You know, for us, we would look at it as something completely ridiculous. But when I was there, I understood why it was of something of importance, because it shows how they designed it. It shows how we have moved on as a society. It shows the gradual evolution of design, which I thought, this is a very fascinating way of looking at it. So I think for Malaysian railways, Malaysian society, we tend to look at the railways from a very nostalgic lens. We look at it and say, oh, those represents our good old days. I really hope that we would be able to develop railway culture in Malaysia in such a way that we can say that the past was great. Now we've made it even better. So hopefully we can work towards that.
Hopefully. Okay, so all right. Okay, we received some questions in the comment box. First is by Elaine Morris. She asked, how do the trams complement the service offered by the railways?
Interesting. The way that we can think of it is that the railways connects city to city or city to suburbs, but the trams essentially move people around within the city itself. So it serves that particular city. It is very much urban connection. So certain tram systems might also introduce, all across Japan, the train fares are based on distance. So you pay according to how far you travel. But in certain tram systems, what they've done is they've created this system where you just pay a flat rate. And as long as you pay that flat rate, you can travel as much as you want within the city. So that, in a way, has promoted not just ease of use for the locals to travel around, but also for outsiders coming into cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Right? So for me, the cheapest and laziest way of actually seeing the whole city, is to just pay this flat rate and then sit in the tram the whole day. You essentially get to see everything. So the area that it focuses is very different. Another feature that these railway companies have implemented is that they make it really easy for you to find out, to navigate. So you can use apps to navigate yourself, and also payment system. They tend to implement that one cash card that you can just use on every system. So that creates this feeling of like it never becomes an obstacle for me to think about using these systems. There is a sense of comfort. So I don't feel this sense of fear that, oh, I have to buy a token with the right amount for the right destination or anything like that. There is this comfort of me knowing that I can just get on the tram, just beat, and no worries. And on the trams also, there's usually someone there, compared to trains or subways. So there's always someone there to help you out. So that creates this very human environment, which I really like.
Wow, very interesting. We received some comments too. Shall I just read some comments before back to another questions? This is from Siang Lim. Thank you for sharing. We lost a number of historical railway stations when the double tracking system was constructed. Okay. And then this is from Megumi Tsuda. I visited the old Kuala Lumpur railway station. It was really beautiful and worth to preserve, but it seems it's not care much. I feel it's sad and motainai. Okay. All right. So back to another questions from Chong Si Ming. What would you like to research if you visit Japan again? Because due to COVID, you were asked to come back to Malaysia in a very short time because you need to shorten the fellowships. So yeah, what would you like to research if you visit Japan again? What is the missing parts of the research?
First of all, hi Siming. Thank you so much for joining. Yes, my trip was unfortunately cut short because of the pandemic. I was supposed to visit a few other railway lines in the north, in Hokkaido. I was supposed to visit a very small town called Yubari, where there is an abandoned railway line that was used for coal mining and then was restarted again as a tourist experience. So I wanted to look at that. But at that time, the number of cases were increasing in Hokkaido. So I decided, okay, maybe I don't go to Hokkaido. The area that I've covered is actually a very, very small area. Although from the photos that I've presented, it might look like I've covered a large area, I've only covered a very small section. And I think many people who are interested in railways, particularly in Japan, they spend their entire lives exploring the railways. That's how committed they are. I don't think I can ever follow in their footsteps, and I think my approach is also very different. But I think there are many other areas that I also wanted to visit. There is the tourist lines in Miyazaki, another line in Kyoto that I did not get to ride on, and most importantly, I did not get to visit the railway museum in Saitama, which is one of the largest railway museum. So there are some missing areas. What I wanted to do with this project was to create a mapping of railway museums. And if anyone downloads my final report, you will see that it is very much focused on doing a review, in a sense, of the railway museums in Java, in Indonesia, and also across Japan. So hopefully I'll be able to expand on it. And I've also made it available publicly in such a way that anyone else who visits these railway museums and would like to contribute to it, to that document, they can also do so.
How long do you think it will take for you to go to those places?
Another year, perhaps.
Okay.
I think the case with Japan is that no matter how much you visit, how much you travel, there will always be someone who says, "Hey, by the way, you missed this one place," and then you feel, okay, great, now I have to go back again.
But it happens, right? So you keep on like
Yes.
back and forth. It's like never ends.
That's the best part. Yes.
And then, okay, Mahen, this is from Clement Liang. Do you find it confusing to take trains in Japan? There are complex timetables and almost no English spoken. So could you share? I mean, like when you go to Japan and then you're like talking to people. So how about the language barrier?
There was definitely a language barrier. I don't speak Japanese, but it's amazing how fast you tend to adapt. I think this is something that we Southeast Asians do extremely well. We adapt in different societies very, very quickly. So in that way, I was able to communicate with people very simply. As to traveling on the railway lines itself, there are numerous apps that are available in English, and these are apps that are created by the railway companies themselves. And these apps are incredible because there is so much certainty and confidence in it. When the app says that this train will be on platform 4 at 1:42 p.m., there is nothing in the world that can stop it from being there at 1:42 p.m. except maybe Godzilla coming and eating up that train. And that creates this sense of certainty that you don't have to worry. Compared to taking trains in many other parts of the world, where how do you know the train arrive? When do you know the train will arrive? When you see it arriving. So moving around, of course, I relied on these apps. I also relied on just understanding how the system works and learning how to read kanji. So you just look at the timetable and you identify the characters and say, okay, I better look out for this one character. Because sometimes when you look at the train, you have to wait for the Japanese characters, the kanji, to change into Roman alphabets to be able to read it. Sometimes it's too late and you tend to miss the train. So you have to be quite smart and just try to read it in Japanese. That was really fun. Because sometimes when you're waiting for trains, you just look at these names of these places like Okayama and whatnot. And you start looking at the characters and say, this is a good chance for me to learn. So I think that was fun.
So you're studying at the same time.
Yeah.
Not just doing research, also learn about the language. Okay. We have one final question now from Zarif Ismail. Do you have your personal favorite station and why?
What a challenging question. It's hard to pick. I think my favorite station would be I think it would be Kyoto Station. Mainly because it offers so much and it offers this a multitude of experiences. Now, even though I showed this image of a hyper-modern building, there are certain areas of that station itself that offers a glimpse of the past. And I remember this one time when I was just standing at one of the older platforms. So every time I buy like a ticket, I'm hoping that, I hope to stand on one of the older platforms. I remember standing at this, the earliest platform, and it was early in the morning, and the platform was filled with people dressed in suits and all. They were all going to work, right? Everything looked like, okay, modern Japan. And out of the blue, out of nowhere, without warning, right, the whole platform was just filled with steam when a steam locomotive just came by. And in that moment, you just felt like you were transported back in time, because you look around you and people are still dressed in the same way as they did before, in Western suits. You look at the platform, it's still the old structure. And then there is a steam locomotive just passing through. And that was such a magical moment. Usually we talk about looking at a steam locomotive. We talk about riding on the steam locomotive as an experience. But sometimes just having a steam locomotive appear unplanned out of nowhere, creates this sense of magic. And I think it just stirs that child within you. So it was because of this memory that I think, I would say this is one of like my favorite station.
Did you able to record that moment for the incoming for the next?
No, it was too fast.
Oh.
Yeah, it was too fast. So it just went by. The smell of steam and charcoal burning in the air. Yeah, it was just something else.
Okay, thank you, Mahen. Okay, okay, let me read some comments. Thank you everyone who gives comments in the chat box, but I'm so sorry for not being able to introduce all of you. So let me read some. From Sui Peng Chan, travel in Japan by bus and trains, the fantastic organization and discipline behind the transport system. I'm always amazed by the timing of buses at railway station to provide feeder services. Bravo. And then from Nurdiana Abdul Rahman, interesting story, Mahen. I travel from Tokyo to Kyoto by local trains in winter, long hours, and collected the stamps too. But awesome experience, especially when stopping by many stations and explore the local cities along the way. Different perspective than being on Shinkansen or express trains. Would you like to comment, Mahen?
I'll comment later if it's possible.
Okay. That is the final comment.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I think, yeah, we're done for today.
Can I just say thank you so much to everyone who has been supporting me over the years with this. And it is your continued support that essentially gives me this feeling that this project is worthwhile, that whatever it is that I'm doing, which is sometimes very challenging to convince people, is worthwhile. And also, I think very importantly, thank you to the Japan Foundation for believing in the project. Like when I said I would like to extend whatever that I'm doing here and to essentially just write about people and places in Japan, I'm very thankful that Japan Foundation looked at it and said, yeah, great, this is a fantastic project to do. I think many other people, many other foundations or corporations especially might look at it and say, this is, there's no benefit in this for us. So having this sense of trust was very, very important for me.
We really hope that you can continue with the research, because it stopped for a while, but we really continue. We really encourage you to continue with the research. Okay, for your information, actually, we and Mahen have been discussing to run a workshop after Mahen finish your fellowship, but it will be a physical workshop.
Yes,
but because of this, but we decided to go ahead with Mahen stop first, considering the COVID situations. So instead of waiting, why not we do something? We continue to do something, right? So yeah, but I believe it was a very today was a very meaningful sharing session to the viewers too. Thank you so much for joining. And Mahen, we are looking forward to have more collaboration with you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mahen. Okay, So, all right, we will share the link of Mahen's website and YouTube on our Facebook and our YouTube channel. Yeah, it's there. And before we end the session today, we would like to ask everyone to help us to fill up the questionnaire form for us to hear your feedback and to improve our events in the future. So you can also click the link share in the comment section and also the QR code that is displayed, there, displayed in the screen. So, and on behalf of JFKL, I hope everyone enjoyed the session today. Thank you so much for joining. And please keep on lookout for the updates for the second episode of this talk series. Take care, everyone, and have a nice Sunday. Bye-bye.